Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. Number 31. Robert Gascoyne-Cecil. The last Victorian. He was Prime Minister 3 times, briefly between 1885 and 1886, then again from 1886 to 1892, and then for the last time from 1895 to 1902. Hello everyone and welcome to Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. Some Prime Ministers are easy to sum up, but Robert Gascoyne-Cecil, the Marquess of Salisbury, definitely isn't one of them. So before we settle down to the latest episode, don't forget to give this episode a like, and if you haven't already, please do subscribe to Long History and Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. Robert Gascoyne-Cecil was a very old-fashioned Conservative. In fact, in many ways, he epitomises a Conservative Prime Minister. In this episode, we'll examine just what made him such a perfect Conservative leader. He was Prime Minister for 13 years, not far off actually 14 years in total, an extraordinarily long time, actually making him the 4th longest serving Prime Minister of all time. Now, of course, this is a feat in itself, but he actually was the longest serving Prime Minister of the democratic era, that is, if we count it being after 1832. So although women didn't get the vote till 1928, we can just about say that Robert Gascoyne-Cecil was the longest serving democratically elected Prime Minister. He's one of the few Prime Ministers also to have been in office on 3 separate occasions. Only Edward Smith Stanley, better known as the Earl of Derby, and Stanley Baldwin also served 3 terms, with William Gladstone being the only Prime Minister to be in office on 4 separate occasions. What was Robert Gascoyne-Cecil like? He was a quiet, shy man, an intellectual, and not particularly sociable. He was very tall, one biography stating that he was 6'4", or at least he would have been had he not walked with a stoop. He was apparently quite a negative man. He seems to have been a bit of an Eeyore, always looking on the negative side of things. He married Georgina Alderson in 1857 and had a total of 8 children. They seem to have been well suited, Georgina filling the gaps left by Gascoyne-Cecil's unsociableness, which verged on misanthropy. His Conservative values stemmed from a desire to set limits on the changes that were taking place in society. Vast changes were taking place in society at that time, and he wanted to make sure that the old, proven ways of doing things weren't thrown by the wayside, particularly as the opposition Liberal Party attempted to push through significant reforms, not least Home Rule for the Irish. He disliked any form of radicalism. His ambitions in foreign affairs were modest and practical, rather than outlandish and bombastically imperialistic. For example, he lamented the process where companies would expand into new parts of the world and then, when things went wrong, would expect the government to defend their interests. The future Marquess of Salisbury in his early years was not due to inherit his father's fortune, which was going to go to his older brother. This meant, in turn, that he had to choose a profession, and made a living writing political journalism, which he continued during his early days as an MP as a way to make a living. MPs at that point didn't earn a wage. Although he didn't like change, when his older brother died in 1865, he nevertheless accepted the change that involved him inheriting the family fortune when his father died, which he promptly did in 1868. Gladstone was Gascoyne-Cecil's principal opposition leader, with the 2 men alternating power in the 1880s and 1890s as the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party alternated power. Of these 2 men, apparently, Queen Victoria much preferred Gascoyne-Cecil, liking the latter's modest religiosity over Gladstone's more hectoring version of religion. Most notably, perhaps, Gascoyne-Cecil was the last aristocrat to be Prime Minister. Now, there's one exception there, Alex Douglas Hume, who was Prime Minister briefly between 1963 and 1964. He was also from an aristocratic background, however, things had moved on by that point, so he had to resign his title before he could take up the position of Prime Minister. Robert Gascoyne-Cecil, therefore, was the last Prime Minister to rule as an aristocrat from the so-called upper chamber, the House of Lords. Gascoyne-Cecil was very unsure about the developments that came with giving the vote to an increasing number of people. After the French Revolution of the previous century, and more recently for him the American Civil War, he was very wary of letting the public have more of a say in politics. There was another angle to Gascoyne-Cecil's conservatism. Although he resisted change, particularly democratic change in this case, he was willing and able to bend his views when changes did take place. The democratic reforms that had took place weren't quite as alarming in practice as he had thought they would be in principle. Also, he was interested in science, and his house at Hatfield was apparently the first in the UK to have electric light. What was the historical background? The late Victorian period was a time when the developments of that century, the transformations caused by the Industrial Revolution, and the fundamental changes in society and politics began to take hold, and it was clear that they weren't going to be reversed. Previously, aristocrats had ruled, with some non-aristocrats being granted the ability to vote, but by this point, in the late Victorian era, more ordinary men of course, were having a say in politics. By this point, the vote as an aristocratic responsibility had been replaced by the vote as a right for an increasing number of men. Ireland had already been an issue for many decades, if not centuries. In the 1880s, however, the idea of Home Rule, where the Irish would have their own government within the United Kingdom, began to gather force. It was a popular cause for Gladstone, Gascoyne-Cecil's opposite Liberal Party leader, but Gascoyne-Cecil of course didn't like change, and so he didn't support this policy. This policy led to divisions in both parties actually, with elections in that period being won and lost over the balance of power held by Irish constituencies. Another huge issue of this period, more specifically the 1890s, was imperialism. Now this is most definitely a topic that is way above the remit of this short essay, but according to the brief reading on this topic, the 1890s was apparently a time when the notion of imperialism crystallised as a concept. This was the time when the image of empires as the subject of a boy's own adventure first grew, not least in the era of Rudyard Kipling. As European powers began to catch up with the UK's industrialisation, what had previously been relatively loose, trade-based relationships ultimately, in this era, began to be solidified and formalised, as it became important to clarify where one empire's claim finished and another began. This was the era, for example, of the so-called Scramble for Africa. The Boer Wars took place during this time, between 1880 and 1881, and 1899 and 1902. This was when the British attempted to assert their dominance over the historically Dutch Boer population in South Africa. This attempt to assert dominance over a whole region came at a heavy cost to the British, including the deaths of some 22,000 soldiers, from the UK itself and the Empire, and in itself this raised the question of what an empire was for, and what benefits it was bringing the people back home. The principal works about Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Conan Doyle were published during this era, along with The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. What was happening in the US at the time? Across the Atlantic, this was the time of the so-called Gilded Age, a period of economic growth after the American Civil War. This particularly involved the growth of the railways and the incorporation of Western states into the United States. These included North and South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, Wyoming and Utah. The president during Robert Gascoyne-Cecil's premiership in the meantime included Grover Cleveland, Benjamin Harrison, William McKinley and briefly Theodore Roosevelt. Who could vote at this time? This was very much a live issue during the early days of Robert Gascoyne-Cecil's time in Parliament. He actually resigned from the government over the issue of giving more men the vote in 1867. Yes, he wasn't just theoretically against this issue, he actually resigned because of it. And he particularly took against the leader of the Conservatives at that time, Benjamin Disraeli, because he pushed through these changes. Robert Gascoyne-Cecil wrestled with a dilemma that came with the increasing size of the electorate. In 1832 and 1867, the vote had been given to a wider set of people, yet it came with a rather simple quandary for aristocrats such as Robert Gascoyne-Cecil. With more and more people voting for the future of the country, what would happen if all these poor people just voted for the rich to pay all the taxes while the poor benefited from them? How, from this point of view, could that possibly be fair? What would be the point, in the meantime, of being an aristocrat, giving away power, so that you'd then have to give all your money away? Gascoyne-Cecil eventually conceded that there was a certain inevitability to increasing democracy, but he felt that the old way of doing things, tradition and all that, should be guarded at all costs. What was Robert Gascoyne-Cecil's background? As can only be expected from the last aristocratic Prime Minister, Gascoyne-Cecil was very well connected, the Cecil surname notably cropping up in histories around the time of Elizabeth I and James I. At this point in every episode of Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, we look into the education of the Prime Minister. And regular listeners will be placing their usual bets and will, once more, be correct in assuming that Gascoyne-Cecil had that most establishment of backgrounds, being one of the 19 Prime Ministers to go to Eton and one of the 31 to go to Oxford. In this particular period, an even more eye-opening educational record occurred. Gascoyne-Cecil was one of 3 Prime Ministers in a row to have exactly the same education. Yes, Gladstone, his supposed political rival, had the same education, along with Archibald Primrose, known as the Earl of Rosebery. All 3 Prime Ministers went to both Eton and Oxford, and they actually went to the same college in Oxford. Having said that, Robert Gascoyne-Cecil's time at Eton was, apparently, cut short because he was badly bullied. At Oxford, in the meantime, he was eventually given an honorary 4th-class degree, one that was granted to him because of his aristocratic background and because he'd been unable to fully finish his degree due to ill health. Instead of focusing on his formal education during that time, he went travelling to improve his health, which in itself proved a different type of education, his visits to places such as Australia and New Zealand informing his future interest in international issues. He became the MP for Stamford in 1853, when he was 23. At that time, it was a not unsurprising pursuit for a younger son, as Gascoyne-Cecil was, at least before his elder brother died and he became due to inherit the family fortune. He wasn't the only younger son to be Prime Minister, however, the Duke of Newcastle's younger brother, Henry Pelham, being another notable younger brother turned politician to reach the top job. Gascoyne-Cecil's first experience in government came under the Earl of Derby during a brief administration in the late 1860s, when he became Secretary of State for India. He was therefore a member of the government during those 1867 reforms which he had very much opposed. Just a year later, he inherited his title, which meant he could take a seat in the House of Lords, so no longer needed to be an MP and to sit in the House of Commons. And it was because he'd opposed those democratic reforms and had indeed resigned over the issue that he was seen by the rest of the House of Lords as a man who would stand up for his principles, and in particular would stand up for the old guard, who were understandably wary of these democratic developments. How did Gascoyne-Cecil become Prime Minister? As we've said, when that Second Reform Act of 1867 took place, Gascoyne-Cecil took against Benjamin Disraeli, but his opinion apparently changed when, in the mid-1870s, Benjamin Disraeli asked Gascoyne-Cecil to serve as his Secretary of State for India, his second stint in the role in another of Disraeli's governments. At that point, he'd grown to appreciate Disraeli's ability to fraternise with people, something the much shyer Gascoyne-Cecil was more than happy to leave to someone else. This seems to have been where Gascoyne-Cecil gained both his experience and his liking for dealing with overseas issues in particular. He became Foreign Secretary in 1878, a position he would also maintain during many of his years as Prime Minister. When the Conservatives were in opposition, Benjamin Disraeli died in 1881, and Gascoyne-Cecil jointly took over his job as the leader of the Conservative Party. As he was in the House of Lords, due to his inherited title, he led the party jointly with Sir Stafford Northcote, who was an MP in the House of Commons. However, Gascoyne-Cecil took over sole leadership of the party in 1885 as he was better at dealing with Gladstone, who was the Prime Minister at that time. During these years in opposition, Gascoyne-Cecil made efforts to reach out into new areas. Traditionally, the Conservatives had been popular among rural voters, and Gascoyne-Cecil made efforts to woo businessmen and city dwellers. When Gladstone's government fell due to its own infighting in 1885, Gascoyne-Cecil was asked to form a government for the first time, taking on his first stint as Prime Minister. It wouldn't last long, however. A general election was held in December of that year, and the Conservative Party didn't manage to gain a majority. The big issue of the mid-1880s, as we've stated, was Home Rule for Ireland. Gascoyne-Cecil opposed it, and Gladstone's Liberal Party was very much in favour of it. When Gladstone attempted to push through Home Rule for Ireland, however, it led to splits in both parties, but many members of the Liberal Party in particular thought that it was a step too far. And when Gladstone held a general election to clarify who had the most support on this issue, he actually lost, and this meant that Gascoyne-Cecil became Prime Minister for the second time, only 6 months after his first stint had ended. What were Robert Gascoyne-Cecil's biggest achievements as Prime Minister? These were fractious times in politics, and Gascoyne-Cecil never actually managed a majority administration. All his governments were based on coalitions or minority administrations, meaning that keeping these fractious parties together was in itself an achievement, all the while holding on to his very conservative beliefs that change was bad, but the ruling classes sometimes had to allow change in order to maintain a stable society. It was a conservative notion going back to the origins of conservatism with Robert Peel in the 1840s. Gascoyne-Cecil is credited with a level head, and as Foreign Secretary, he was particularly skilled at working through crises which, it is said, could easily have spiralled out of control, particularly with the machinations of the great powers of the time, Russia, Germany and France, and during the time of the scramble for Africa. He's quoted as saying the following about his personal vision of foreign policy, which, largely, was to avoid wars, or as he put it, to float lazily downstream, putting out the occasional diplomatic boat hook. The term splendid isolation has been used to describe the UK's foreign policy during much of the 19th century, but by the end of that century, under Gascoyne-Cecil's tenure, there was a sense that the UK had isolated itself to the point of having, no friends or even allies, which would eventually lead to a rude awakening in the new century. Indeed, it's noteworthy that things did spin out of control between all these powers not too long after Gascoyne-Cecil stopped being Prime Minister. His reforms in the UK at home were modest, befitting a Prime Minister who wanted to maintain a status quo and who wanted to act as a counterweight to the reforms offered by the Liberal Party. He was involved in the creation of the county councils, however, and offered free primary education to all children, while raising the age when children left school to 11. Why did Robert Gascoyne-Cecil stop being Prime Minister? Actually, he doesn't fit neatly into our usual questions asked for random UK Prime Minister of the Week, not least because he had 3 stints as Prime Minister. In 1892, there was another general election which Gladstone won, ousting Gascoyne-Cecil from the job and giving Gladstone his final stint in power. However, Gladstone handed over to a rather disastrous Prime Minister, Archibald Primrose, the Earl of Rosebery, a man who liked the idea of being Prime Minister more than the reality. After another general election in 1895, Gascoyne-Cecil re-entered the job for what was, this time, his longest stint in office. However, by this time he was well into his 60s and appears not to have been very well during the latter years of his tenure. It was during this stint in office that the Second Boer War began. Wars have, not infrequently actually, bolstered a Prime Minister's standing with the public, and in Gascoyne-Cecil's final election in 1900 he did gain another majority. This 1900 election was referred to as the khaki election, with Gascoyne-Cecil's Conservatives, not for the first time, not for the only time, running as the Patriots, while the Liberals were said to support the other side. Gascoyne-Cecil's health was declining when, in 1902, he resigned as Prime Minister to be replaced by Arthur Balfour, his nephew, in a rather blatant moment of nepotism actually. Gascoyne-Cecil died a year later, with his nephew remaining Prime Minister for just over 3 years before the Liberal Party, headed by Henry Campbell Bannerman, began a significant stint in power. Why should we remember Robert Gascoyne-Cecil? He was, as we've said in the title, the last of the Victorian Prime Ministers, and he was the last of the aristocratic Prime Ministers ruling from the House of Lords. It is noticeable how, not just with Queen Victoria's passing, but also with Gascoyne-Cecil's departure as Prime Minister, that a particular era came crashing to a halt. Arthur Balfour, Gascoyne-Cecil's nephew and successor as Prime Minister, couldn't replicate his uncle's success. There was a two-step backlash to Gascoyne-Cecil's conservatism. Step 1 began when the progressive Liberal government began its long stint in power in 1905, leading to many reforms such as the introduction of pensions and unemployment benefits. The second step was that unleashing of power that had been suppressed under Gascoyne-Cecil between all those different empires, which would of course eventually lead to World War I. There would be no more aristocratic prime ministers after Gascoyne-Cecil, and the British Empire, by this point, had reached a particular purple phase that couldn't and wouldn't last. Now, everything I'm about to say in the following sentence is arguable, but please see it as a starting point to look into the details yourself. Gascoyne-Cecil is the epitome of a particular type of conservative politician. If you want your leader to be posh, an aristocrat, but one of the good ones, a quiet man, not at all populist, intelligent, and a traditionalist, but able to bend enough to allow a little modest modernity in when necessary, Gascoyne-Cecil was in many ways the perfect man for the job. He was a perfect Conservative Prime Minister. Thank you everyone as always for listening to this latest episode of Random UK Prime Minister of the Week. If you haven't already, please do give it a like. Don't forget to explore all our other episodes. But above all, thank you for listening. This was Random UK Prime Minister of the Week, number 31, Robert Gascoyne-Cecil, the last Victorian. Goodbye.